Natalie Cochran, a Raleigh County woman convicted of murdering her husband, returned to the courtroom earlier today.
Imagine discovering that the person you trust most, the one you share a home, a family, and a future with, has been living a completely different life behind your back. Not just hiding a few secrets, but secretly taking millions of dollars from friends and neighbors, building an elaborate financial deception, and then, when everything begins to unravel, the person closest to them suddenly dies under deeply suspicious circumstances. This isn't the plot of a Hollywood thriller. According to court records and investigators, it's the story that unfolded in southern West Virginia, a case that shocked an entire community and ultimately ended with multiple criminal convictions. Today, we're taking a closer look at the rise and fall of Natalie Paige Cochran, a licensed pharmacist whose outward image of success concealed years of deception, and the mysterious death of her husband, Brandon Cochran. This is a story about trust, greed, and the devastating consequences of fraud, and as investigators would later uncover, almost nothing about the Cochran family's finances was what it appeared to be. Let's begin. For many people living in Raleigh County, West Virginia, Natalie Paige Cochran appeared to have everything. She was educated, respected, and worked as a licensed pharmacist, a profession that requires years of training and carries a high level of public trust. Alongside her husband, Brandon Cochran, she seemed to be building a successful life. Friends described the family as hardworking and financially comfortable. The couple projected the image of ambitious entrepreneurs. But behind closed doors, investigators later alleged that their financial empire was built on promises that could never be kept. Years before criminal charges would make national headlines, Natalie began promoting what she described as lucrative government contracting opportunities. According to federal prosecutors, she told investors she had access to confidential opportunities involving government construction projects, and that their money would generate unusually high returns in a short period of time. The pitch sounded convincing. She spoke confidently. She appeared knowledgeable. And because she already had an established reputation within the community, many people believed her. Some investors handed over tens of thousands of dollars. Others invested their retirement savings. A few reportedly invested hundreds of thousands. Many believed they weren't simply making an investment. They believed they were helping a trusted friend grow a successful business. For years, the operation appeared to work. Early investors sometimes received payments, reinforcing the illusion that the business was thriving. That apparent success encouraged additional investments. But investigators would later argue that the profits weren't coming from government contracts at all. Instead, prosecutors said new investor money was allegedly being used to pay earlier investors, a hallmark of a Ponzi-style scheme. As more money flowed in, Natalie and Michael's lifestyle appeared increasingly extravagant. Court records later described expensive vehicles, luxury vacations, jewelry, designer purchases, and high-end real estate acquisitions. To outsiders, it looked like the rewards of successful entrepreneurship. But prosecutors would argue something very different. They claimed the lavish spending was funded largely by investor money. The total amount involved would eventually exceed millions of dollars. The impact reached far beyond financial loss. Some victims later testified that they had invested life savings. Others delayed retirement. Several families experienced severe financial hardship after the scheme collapsed. The emotional damage was just as significant as the financial losses. Many victims weren't strangers. They were neighbors, friends, people who believed they were helping someone they trusted. Trust, once broken, can leave wounds that last for years. Yet despite growing financial pressure, few outside the family realized how unstable everything had become. As federal investigators would later discover, the business wasn't generating the income that investors had been promised. Instead, the entire operation depended on constantly attracting new money. And eventually, that became impossible. By 2019, warning signs were beginning to emerge. Some investors reportedly started asking difficult questions. Payments slowed. Promises became harder to explain. Federal authorities began examining the business more closely. Unknown to many, the walls were beginning to close in. But before the fraud investigation reached its dramatic conclusion, something far more disturbing happened. On February 11, 2019, Michael Brandon Cochran suddenly became gravely ill. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Despite medical treatment, he died only days later at the age of 38. At first, his death did not immediately trigger a homicide investigation. Doctors believed he had died from natural causes related to illness. Friends and family mourned what appeared to be a tragic and unexpected loss. But years later, investigators would revisit that conclusion. New evidence, and a closer examination of the circumstances surrounding Michael's death, would lead authorities to suspect that he had not died naturally after all. Instead, prosecutors would eventually allege that Michael had been deliberately poisoned with insulin, despite not having diabetes. It was an accusation that transformed an already massive fraud investigation into something far darker. What had begun as a financial crime case was now becoming a homicide investigation. And as detectives dug deeper into Natalie Cochran's finances, digital records, medical evidence, and timeline of events, they believed they were uncovering a pattern that connected fraud, deception, and murder. The woman many people knew as a successful pharmacist was now facing allegations unlike anything her community had ever imagined. But one question remained. Why would someone who already faced enormous financial pressure allegedly take such a drastic step? To answer that, investigators would begin tracing the money, every bank transfer, every investment, every financial promise, and what they uncovered would reveal a financial deception that had been hiding in plain sight for years. By early 2019, the image Natalie Paige Cochran had carefully built over the years was beginning to crack. To friends and investors, she still appeared confident. She continued to reassure people that business was moving forward and that returns were just around the corner. But behind that confidence, investigators would later argue, the financial reality was very different. The money was running out. According to federal prosecutors, Natalie had spent years convincing people to invest in what she described as government construction contracts. She claimed her businesses had access to profitable opportunities tied to federal agencies and large infrastructure projects. Investors were told their money would help finance these contracts, and that they would receive substantial returns once the projects were completed. For many people, the explanation sounded believable. Natalie was a licensed pharmacist with a respected career. She spoke confidently about business and finance, and because many investors knew her personally, they saw little reason to doubt her. Trust became one of the scheme's greatest assets. Over time, that trust attracted more investors. Some invested savings meant for retirement. Others borrowed money or reinvested previous payouts, believing the business was thriving. According to evidence presented in court, millions of dollars flowed into accounts connected to Natalie and her businesses. But investigators later said there was a major problem. They found little evidence that the government contracts investors had been promised actually existed. Instead, prosecutors argued that much of the incoming money was used to pay earlier investors, creating the appearance of a profitable business while relying on new investments to keep the operation going. This is why schemes like this can continue for years. As long as new money keeps coming in, the illusion can survive. Once that flow slows down, everything begins to collapse. Investigators later traced how investor funds were allegedly spent. Court records described purchases that had little to do with legitimate business operations. Money was allegedly used for luxury vehicles, expensive travel, jewelry, high-end shopping, and other personal expenses. To outsiders, these purchases reinforced the image of success. People often assume visible wealth is proof of a thriving business. In reality, investigators said the spending masked growing financial instability. The more money that came in, the more money had to go out. And with every new investor, the pressure increased. As months passed, questions became harder to answer. Some investors expected their promised returns. Others wanted to withdraw their money. According to testimony, excuses became more frequent. Projects were delayed. Payments were postponed. Unexpected complications were blamed. While those explanations may have bought time, they couldn't solve the underlying problem. If prosecutors were correct, the business model depended on attracting fresh investments. Without new money, there was no way to meet existing obligations. The financial pressure continued to grow. Federal investigators eventually began examining the businesses more closely. They reviewed bank records, financial statements, emails, and transaction histories. Piece by piece, they reconstructed where the money had gone. Their investigation pointed to a pattern they believed showed fraud rather than legitimate investing. For the victims, the findings were devastating. Many realized they had not simply made a bad investment. According to prosecutors, they had been deceived from the beginning. Some families lost retirement funds they had spent decades building. Others faced severe financial hardship. The emotional impact extended beyond the money itself. Many victims said they struggled with feelings of betrayal because the person they had trusted wasn't a stranger. It was someone they knew personally. Meanwhile, another tragedy had already changed the course of the investigation. Just days after Brandon Cochran's sudden death in February 2019, Natalie continued handling financial matters while friends and family mourned. At that point, authorities were focused primarily on the suspected investment fraud. Michael's death had not yet been classified as suspicious. But as investigators dug deeper into the finances, they began asking broader questions. Who knew the true state of the business? What role, if any, did Michael play? And could his sudden death somehow be connected to the unraveling financial scheme? Those questions would linger for years. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, they eventually decided Michael's death deserved a second look. Medical records were re-examined. Witnesses were interviewed again. Experts reviewed toxicology findings and the circumstances leading up to his hospitalization. What they discovered would dramatically change the direction of the entire case. The investigation was no longer just about missing money. It was about whether a husband had been deliberately killed. And if so, why? That answer would emerge from one of the most complex homicide investigations West Virginia had seen in years. When Brandon Cochran died in February 2019, most people believed they were witnessing a heartbreaking tragedy. He was only 38 years old. Family members grieved. Friends attended his funeral. And at first, there appeared to be no reason to suspect that anything criminal had happened. But sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs in an investigation don't come immediately. They come months, or even years, later. As federal investigators continued examining Natalie Cochran's finances, they weren't just looking at bank accounts and investment records. They were trying to understand the full picture. According to prosecutors, the financial situation surrounding the Cochran family had become increasingly desperate. Investigators began asking who knew about the mounting problems and whether anyone close to Natalie might have uncovered the truth. Those questions eventually brought Michael's death back into focus. Detectives revisited his medical records and interviewed witnesses who had interacted with him in the days leading up to his hospitalization. They also consulted medical experts. The more they reviewed, the more investigators believed Michael's death deserved a closer look. According to trial testimony, Michael became seriously ill over several days. He experienced symptoms that worsened rapidly, eventually requiring emergency medical care. Despite treatment, his condition continued to decline. He died on February 11, 2019. At the time, there was no immediate murder charge. But investigators later alleged that the true cause of his illness had been hidden. Prosecutors argued that Michael, who was not diagnosed with diabetes, had been exposed to repeated doses of insulin. Insulin is a medication used to lower blood sugar in people with diabetes. In someone who does not need it, excessive insulin can cause dangerously low blood sugar, a condition known as hypoglycemia, which can lead to seizures, brain injury, coma, and death if not treated promptly. Because insulin occurs naturally in the body, proving that someone was intentionally given extra insulin can be medically challenging. That made the investigation especially complex. As the investigation progressed, authorities took the unusual step of exhuming Michael's body so additional forensic examinations could be conducted. This marked a major turning point. Exhumations are not routine. They are generally ordered only when investigators believe new evidence could significantly change the understanding of a person's death. Medical experts re-examined tissue samples, laboratory findings, and hospital records. According to prosecutors, those findings supported the theory that Michael's death was consistent with insulin poisoning. Natalie Cochran has consistently denied intentionally killing her husband, and her defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's interpretation of the medical evidence during the legal proceedings. Ultimately, it would be up to a jury to decide which explanation was more convincing. Investigators also worked to reconstruct Michael's final days. They reviewed phone records, financial documents, electronic communications, witness statements, and timelines showing who had access to him before he became critically ill. Every detail mattered. The prosecution's case relied not on a single piece of evidence but on the combination of medical findings, financial records, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence presented together. According to prosecutors, the timing raised important questions. The alleged investment fraud was coming under increasing scrutiny. Financial pressure was mounting. And investigators argued that Michael may have known more about the family's finances than people initially realized. The prosecution suggested that his death removed someone who could have complicated Natalie's situation. The defense disputed that theory and argued that the state's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof of murder. As the homicide investigation gained momentum, what had started as a white-collar crime case evolved into something far more serious. The allegations now extended beyond fraud. Authorities accused Natalie of intentionally causing her husband's death. The case drew widespread attention across West Virginia. Residents who had followed the fraud investigation were stunned. Many struggled to reconcile the allegations with the image they had known for years: a respected healthcare professional, a business owner, and a mother. The contrast between public perception and the accusations made the case all the more shocking. With investigators believing they had assembled enough evidence, prosecutors moved forward. Natalie Cochran now faced two separate legal battles. One in federal court over the alleged investment fraud. Another in state court over the death of Michael Cochran. The outcome of those trials would determine whether the evidence convinced two different juries beyond a reasonable doubt. And as witnesses prepared to testify, financial experts organized years of records, and medical specialists finalized their opinions, the courtroom became the place where every piece of the puzzle would finally be laid before a jury. Would the prosecution succeed in proving both fraud and murder? Or would the defense persuade jurors that the evidence left room for reasonable doubt? Those answers would come during two closely watched trials that captured the attention of the entire state.
The allegations against Natalie Paige Cochran had shaken an entire community, but allegations alone are not enough to convict someone. In the American justice system, prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, after years of investigations, financial analysis, forensic examinations, and witness interviews, it was time for two juries to hear the evidence. The first major legal battle centered on the alleged investment fraud. Federal prosecutors argued that for years Natalie had convinced friends, relatives, and members of her community to invest in businesses she claimed were involved in profitable government contracting. According to the prosecution, investors were promised impressive returns and told their money would finance legitimate projects. Instead, prosecutors alleged that the businesses generated little or no legitimate revenue from the contracts investors had been promised. To support their case, they introduced financial records, bank statements, business documents, and testimony from numerous victims. One by one, investors described why they had trusted Natalie. Some had known her for years. Others believed her professional background made her trustworthy. Several testified that they invested retirement savings or money they had spent years building. When payments stopped and questions went unanswered, many realized they might never recover what they had lost. For them, the financial losses were devastating, but so was the sense of betrayal. The prosecution also relied on forensic accountants. These specialists traced the movement of millions of dollars through various accounts. According to their analysis, much of the money was allegedly diverted to personal spending rather than the business activities investors had been promised. Jurors were shown records of significant personal purchases and expenditures that prosecutors argued were inconsistent with a legitimate investment operation. The defense challenged the government's interpretation of the evidence, arguing that business failures and poor financial decisions do not automatically amount to criminal fraud. After considering the evidence, however, the federal jury found Natalie Cochran guilty on multiple fraud-related charges. The convictions marked a major victory for federal prosecutors, but an even more serious trial was still ahead. Unlike the fraud case, the murder trial did not revolve around bank records. It focused on medicine, science, and whether prosecutors could prove that Brandon Cochran had been intentionally poisoned. Because there were no eyewitnesses and no confession, the state's case depended heavily on circumstantial evidence supported by expert testimony. Medical specialists explained how insulin affects the human body. They described how excessive insulin can drive blood sugar to dangerously low levels, and why that can be fatal in someone who does not require insulin treatment. The prosecution argued that Michael's medical condition matched that explanation. Experts testified about laboratory findings, hospital records, and the sequence of symptoms leading to his death. The state also argued that Natalie, as a licensed pharmacist, possessed extensive knowledge of medications, including insulin and its effects. Prosecutors suggested that this knowledge was significant when considering how Michael became ill. The defense urged jurors not to draw conclusions based solely on Natalie's profession. They challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the medical evidence, and argued that the state had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael had been intentionally poisoned. Defense attorneys also questioned whether the prosecution's timeline and theory fully accounted for all the medical complexities in the case. Over the course of the trial, jurors listened to days of testimony. Doctors, medical experts, investigators, family members, financial specialists. Each witness added another piece to the larger picture. For jurors, the task was not to decide whether the case was tragic. It clearly was. Their responsibility was to determine whether the evidence met the high legal standard required for a criminal conviction. After deliberating, the jury reached its verdict. Natalie Paige Cochran was found guilty of the murder of her husband, Brandon Cochran. The verdict brought an emotional response inside the courtroom. For Michael's family, it represented years of waiting for answers. For investigators, it marked the conclusion of one of the most complex cases they had worked. For the victims of the fraud scheme, it closed another chapter in a long and painful ordeal. The court later imposed separate sentences for the fraud convictions and the murder conviction. Together, they ensured that Natalie Cochran would spend decades in prison. While the legal proceedings had come to an end, the consequences of the case continued long afterward. Many victims never recovered the money they had invested. Families were left rebuilding their lives. Friends who had once trusted the Cochrans found themselves reflecting on how easily appearances can conceal deeper problems. The case became a reminder that financial fraud often causes damage extending far beyond dollars and cents. It can destroy friendships, reputations, and entire communities. And in this case, according to the verdict, it also resulted in the loss of a human life. Yet even after the verdicts, one question continued to linger in the minds of many people. How could someone who appeared successful, educated, and respected become the central figure in one of West Virginia's most notorious criminal cases? That question speaks to a larger lesson, one that goes beyond this single story. When the courtroom emptied, and the headlines began to fade, the consequences of the Natalie Paige Cochran case did not disappear. For one family, a husband and father was gone. For dozens of investors, years of hard-earned savings had vanished. And for an entire community, a painful question remained. How could someone so trusted allegedly deceive so many people for so long? One of the lasting impacts of this case wasn't just the amount of money involved. It was the people behind those numbers. According to court records, many victims were ordinary working families. Some had invested retirement savings after being promised strong returns. Others believed they were helping a friend grow a successful business. For them, the financial loss was only part of the story. Many later described feeling embarrassed, angry, and betrayed. Several said they blamed themselves for trusting someone they believed they knew. But experts who study financial fraud often point out that these schemes rarely succeed because victims are careless. Instead, they succeed because they rely on trust. Fraudsters frequently build credibility over months or even years. They may have respected careers, strong community ties, or convincing explanations that make their stories seem legitimate. By the time warning signs appear, many victims are emotionally invested as well as financially invested. The Cochran case also highlighted another important lesson. Professional success does not automatically guarantee honesty in every aspect of a person's life. Natalie Cochran had trained as a pharmacist, a profession associated with responsibility and public trust. For many investors, that professional background made her promises seem even more believable. Investigators later argued that this reputation helped her gain the confidence of people who might otherwise have been more cautious. The criminal proceedings also demonstrated how complex white-collar crime investigations can be. Unlike crimes that unfold in a single moment, Financial fraud cases often span years. Investigators must examine thousands of financial records, interview numerous witnesses, analyze electronic communications, and reconstruct complicated transactions. Building a case requires patience. In the Cochran investigation, authorities spent years following the evidence before bringing the full range of charges to court. The homicide investigation was equally challenging. Unlike many murder cases, there was no surveillance video showing the crime, no public confession, no eyewitness claiming to have seen what happened. Instead, prosecutors relied on a combination of medical evidence, forensic analysis, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence. The jury ultimately concluded that the prosecution had met its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As with any criminal conviction, Natalie Cochran has had legal avenues for appeal available through the court system, but the jury's verdict and resulting sentence remain the outcome of the trial. Cases like this often leave people asking the same question: could this have been prevented? There may never be a simple answer, but financial experts consistently recommend a few safeguards before making major investments. Verify that opportunities can be independently confirmed. Be cautious of unusually high or guaranteed returns. Request written documentation. Seek advice from an independent financial professional. And remember that even trusted friends or respected professionals should not be exempt from careful due diligence. These steps cannot eliminate all risk, but they can help reduce the likelihood of becoming a victim. Years from now, the Natalie Paige Cochran case will likely be remembered for more than its verdicts. It will be remembered as a story in which appearances proved deeply misleading. A respected healthcare professional, a seemingly successful business, a family that, from the outside, appeared to be thriving. Yet beneath that image, prosecutors alleged a years-long fraud that ultimately became linked to one of West Virginia's most closely watched homicide cases. The legal process reached its conclusion in the courtroom, but for those whose lives were forever changed, the emotional impact continues. For Michael Brandon Cochran's loved ones, no verdict can bring him back. For investors, no sentence can fully restore the years of savings, trust, and peace of mind they lost. And for the community, the case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous deceptions are often the ones hidden behind familiar faces. Cases like this remind us that the truth is sometimes far more complicated than first impressions. They also show why careful investigations, forensic science, and the legal process play such an important role in uncovering what really happened. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more in-depth true crime stories based on documented investigations and court proceedings. And if there's another case you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.